My name's Steve Shannon, and I am a board member of Historic Vienna, Inc. I see that a number of my fellow board members are here, and thank you, everybody, for being here for this important panel. We have a number of dignitaries I'd like to recognize before I talk about the panel today and introduce our journalists. I see that our mayor, Linda Colbert, is here, and I saw Councilman Ray Brill. Thank you for being here, Councilman. Councilman Chuck Anderson is here, and Councilman Anderson and I are in charge of the education and ongoing events for Liberty Amendments Month. I see our town manager, Mercury Payton, is here, and joining us in a couple minutes is one of my judicial colleagues, Judge David Bernhardt, who you may remember. He moderated the panel we had a couple years ago on Loving versus Virginia. But thank you everybody for being here. Liberty Amendments Month is a very important celebration in the town of Vienna. This is our 4th year doing it. In 2021, Liberty Amendments Month became officially recognized by the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that was largely due to the work of our town manager, Mercury Payton, who thought it was important that we find a way to bring people together to talk about complex issues associated with race, equality, and gender rights, and how to make the United States a more perfect union. And so what Liberty Amendments does is it focuses on 4 of the constitutional amendments that expand rights to citizens who did not previously have such rights. It focuses on the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution, and then the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed people the right to vote regardless of gender. So the Reconstruction Amendments, as many or everybody here probably knows, abolished the institution of slavery, guaranteed equal rights to citizens and naturalization rights to those born in the United States. It guaranteed that people would be able to vote regardless of their race, and then the 19th dealt with the right of people to vote regardless of their gender. So we are in the week of Liberty Amendments Month, where we focus on the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the laws. And tonight's panel focuses on liberty in the press. It's presented to us by the Fairfax County Public Libraries. In particular, what we're focusing on is a significant role that regional Black newspapers and columns have played from emancipation through the civil rights era and beyond. I'm first going to introduce our speakers tonight, and then I'm going to ask Deb Cohen-Smith, who's the Assistant Branch Manager of Patrick Henry Library, who really organized this event, to come up and talk about her ideas for putting this event together. I'm first going to introduce our journalists, and then I'm going to introduce our historians that serve on the panel. So Theodore Johnson is a contributing columnist for the Washington Post, and he's a senior advisor at New America. He's the author of the forthcoming book, If We Are Brave, Essays from Black Americana. Among other distinctions, he's a retired commander of the United States Navy. Alexis Taylor is managing editor of the Afro-American Newspapers, the continuously operating publication founded in Baltimore in 1892 by John H. Murphy, Sr. Her March 2024 article on Black Press Week addressed the ongoing importance of Black media and the leadership of Black journalists. Tonight, she's honored to share insights from the Afro's rich archive of Black history, family life, public achievements, and cultural impact. As far as the historians, you may recognize both the historians. They've been good enough to present at Liberty Amendments Month in past years. My colleague, Georgia Brown, is the lead archivist and manager of the Fairfax Circuit Court Historic Records Center. And the Historic Records Center holds the records of Fairfax County and its courts dating from 1742 through the early 1900s. Georgia got her start at the court archives as an intern in 2015, where her intern project became known as what is now the Fairfax Slavery Index, which has received national recognition as it attempts to capture all enslaved and indentured persons mentioned in our county's court records. And Dr. George Overly III is a history librarian and director of the Center for Mason Legacies at George Mason University. You may remember he spoke on the panel that explored the complexities of George Mason in our inaugural Year of Liberty Amendments Month. The Center for Mason Legacies is an interdisciplinary and collaborative research center housed in the university's Fenwick Library, and it seeks to preserve and examine the legacy of George Mason IV, his ancestors and heirs, and the people that George Mason enslaved. In 2022, Dr. Oberle was the recipient of an American Library Association Award for National Public Service. I would now like to ask Deb Smith-Cohen to come up and talk about her role in putting this together. As I said, Ms. Cohen is Assistant Branch Manager at Patrick Henry Library, and tonight's panel is being presented by the Fairfax County Public Libraries. Thank you very much.
So, hello. I'm going to lower this a little bit. So when I thought of the idea of a program on newspapers and columns published and read by this area's Black population through history, which was back in February when I came up with the idea, I had no idea how much I would learn. As I contacted potential speakers and brushed up on my own researching skills on available archives for these often short-lived publications, I was amazed. And not only amazed by what I learned and read, but also amazed to discover how many tools are available to access the surviving record left by these newspapers through Fairfax County Public Library and through the Library of Virginia and through other sources, so you'll learn something about that. And we have some handouts over here, so if I've made you curious in that way, we can help you take advantage of those resources as well, whether it's for just history buffs or genealogy research or whatever, so check it out and give me a call if you want more help. I hope this presentation and the conversation that follows will give you the same combination of aha moments, connections, and continuing curiosity. Who published these newspapers? Who read them? How were they read and shared? How were they funded? What purposes did they serve for their readership and their community? How and where are they archived today? And what can historians and genealogists learn from them now? What stories can they tell us? As I often say when someone comes up to me with a reference question, I say, let's find out. And with that, I will turn over the program to Dr. Oberle and Ms. Brown to get us started. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Thank you so much for inviting us to talk about this really important topic. Thank you, Judge Shannon, for your incredibly gracious introduction, and thank you, Deb, for arranging this. This is really an exciting opportunity to talk about something I'm very passionate about, which is history, and particularly history that is alive in records. And these, one thing I thought I would start with is understanding that from the very beginning of the Republic, newspapers have been critical in the development of our political landscape as well as our social and economic lives. In many ways, the newspaper kind of evolved and grew up within the period of the Revolution and the promises that were suggested directly about liberty for all. And African Americans heard those kinds of stories, and they heard those promises, and they began to form their own newspapers pretty early on. I will start, though, in 1847, when a gathering in Troy, New York, for the National Convention of Colored People and their delegates from as far west as Michigan and as far south as Kentucky met to discuss the best means to abolish both slavery and the caste system in the United States. That's a quote. A critical part of these discussions over the need to promote education, commerce, and agriculture also focused in on a proposal by a committee by the black physician James McCune Smith, who called for the, quote, creation of a national newspaper for through which, Smith imagined that any and at all times the voice of colored people may be heard. Now, this created some controversy during the committee, but they voted that this was an important event that needed to happen during this period. And now, what's important to also note is black newspapers had already been founded. Freedom's Journal in 1827 by Philip Alexander Bells. Also Philip Alexander Bells, The Colored American in 1837. The Alienid, American, as well as Frederick Douglass's The North Star, are a few examples. Many of these, as Deb mentioned, were very short-lived kinds of publications, but they were really critical in getting African-American voices out into the public sphere. And Georgia and I, my good colleague, are going to share some experiences that we've had in finding stories of Black America by focusing on some of the African-American newspapers in the region. And these stories are found in newspapers using a variety of search strategies. So I'm a librarian at heart, although I'm a historian as well. So I'm going to try to share some of those search strategies with you so you can be more efficient with your own searching, and also to understand the landscape of newspapers. So many African-American newspapers are available through subscription services and different tools. Some of the big three I've put up here. These are Redex, and a new company called Coherent, which has taken over Accessible Archives, and of course, a really big one that many people know a lot about, which is ProQuest. So these three have tons of different titles that are in their resources, and there's very little overlap between them. They tend to have unique content. There's also free and open resources that are available through various newspaper projects, including the Library of Congress's project, as well as Virginia's own participation in that through the Library of Virginia, called the Virginia Chronicle. And what's really important about these is that they provide access for people without having to subscribe to things like ProQuest, which I was just sharing with somebody. One of those databases costs an institution like George Mason like $40,000 to purchase. So it's quite significant. I'm not even allowed to tell you how much. I mean, if you FOIA it, I'm sure, but they're quite significant. So these free and open resources are really critical to kind of understand, and these are available. Now, the public library and some of our other resources do have ProQuest resources that you can use on site, or if you can get a library card and you can use some of them. If you want to, George Mason's right down the road. We are a state institution. Please come and visit us in person, and you can use these resources on site as well. Or you can take our classes and then you can use them as a student. Some of the features of things like this are searching by location. So you can search by Fairfax, Vienna. You can search by towns and cities all through the country. So this is a nice feature that the Library of Virginia has made available. I'm breezing through. You can also search by specific titles. And so if you know of a particular title, one that I immediately went to that a lot of people don't know a lot about is called The Circuit. The Circuit was an African-American newspaper, the only African-American newspaper that we know of, that was published in Northern Virginia, north of Richmond. It was published in a small town called Catlett. Any of you ever been to Catlett? Catlett? Yeah. Small town still, right? And so it's something like, let's see, I did some numbers here. So it was published, let me make sure I get this right, in Catlett from 1937 to 1954. It was published by the Negro Journal Association of Northern Virginia, and the editor was Joseph C. Hackett. Their circulation was reported to be 1,500. To give you context, current population of Catlett, about 300. So this was a really well-circulated newspaper. It was published, monthly, and in fact, it was published before the first Sunday in every month. But there's only 10 remaining extant copies that are available. 5 of them are at the Library of Virginia and have been scanned as part of the Virginia Chronicle Project. There are 6 copies at a local Afro-American Historical Association in Fauquier County. Now, I know you're saying, oh, really, you're a historian, you can't do math, right? 6 and 5. Well, one of them's an overlap, right? So, in essence, there are 10 remaining copies of this really important newspaper. And, it gives us incredible insights into what was going on in African-American life in a small town and in a region that was mostly agricultural, Northern Virginia, at this period, during the time when they're dismantling Jim Crow, at the beginning of the dismantling of Jim Crow. So it's an incredibly important newspaper. I hope we'll find more stuff sometime. All right, I can't talk about newspapers without giving you my library advice. So all my students, the first thing they do is they wanted to start browsing through or keyword searching, But let me tell you, the best way for anybody to search in newspapers is to use a tool called proximity searching. All that means is in this case, I'm doing a search. Do you see my words there? It's Fairfax, near /20, and then in parentheses, I've got colored or Negro. And so the reason I'm doing that is because they use the term colored or Negro in the newspaper at that time. And I want that to be near 20 words of the word Fairfax, and that way I can pick up anything in Fairfax. If I used the Boolean and that we all use every day, right, with just Fairfax and colored, that could show up on page 1, Fairfax, and colored could be, page 10. And so we get a lot of bogus hits. This is a way to do this work smarter. And, this is being recorded. If you don't remember all this, please just get back there or just remember proximity searching. Overly said proximity searching. This is the kind of result. I'm looking at the Baltimore Afro-American, as you can see, which George Mason subscribes to, but also the Library of Virginia has bought this, and you can use this as a citizen of the Commonwealth. Notice here my results are 117 results. So the Baltimore Afro-American has coverage of Fairfax County. Pam, right? That is awesome. And look at these are just the first 3 stories. Colored schools in Fairfax, primitive, unsanitary survey shows. That to me sets off my radar, because unsanitary, blight, all of those terms were what was being used to kind of dispossess African Americans from their properties. So these are some things. And then I would go to my friend Georgia Brown and say, what do you know about this, Georgia? And so there's a whole lot of stuff that can be started with this kind of research. And what I did find that I thought was fascinating, that Georgia and I talked about, was this little story about all the colored fairs that were going on in the region. And I thought that was wonderful. Talk about the kind of getting past like just all the horrors, right, of Jim Crow, and getting into Black life and trying to understand the kind of joys that are going on in the Black community through these colored fairs. So I wanted to learn more. So I said, Georgia, do you know anything about colored fairs? She said, yes, I do. And she's going to show you more in a minute. So I also have to mention, if we're talking about African-American newspapers in Virginia, I have to mention the Richmond Planet, and I can't spend a lot of time on it. But the Richmond Planet was probably one of the most important black newspapers in the Commonwealth. It was first published in 1882. It was founded by 13 former Richmond slaves. The Planet was initially edited by Edwin Archer Randolph, the first African-American graduate of Yale Law School. 2 years later, 21-year-old John Mitchell Jr. succeeded Randolph and continued as editor for the next 45 years, until 1929. The Planet, by 1904, had reached a weekly circulation of 4,200, and the paper also had an incredible reputation as a staunch defender of the African-American community and voice against racial injustice. They spoke up loud when there was injustice in terms of the way that African-American taxes were being misappropriated and used to promote white schools as opposed to their own schools in this so-called separate but equal environment. And he called them out on that, which I'm just a big admirer of Mitchell. He also talked quite a lot about lynching and other injustices. So the Richmond Planet is freely available, part of this Virginia Chronicle, and it's got a rich set of resources. Now, white newspapers can also provide us insights into the African American community. And sometimes we have to read against the sources and use things like these white newspapers. And when you go into the Virginia Chronicle, I'm just showing you a different syntax that's needed for the darn proximity searches. Apparently, nobody can kind of make up their mind on how the structure will be. So in this case, color teachers, right? You would think that's a phrase search, but when you put that little squiggly line and then 20, that's actually colored near 20 words of teachers. And that's the results that come up in this particular database. So I just am giving you another tool. I can make this slideshow available if you need but just email me if you forget as well. And all of this leads to how Georgia and I have collaborated pretty closely by finding stories, my students finding stories, and then I hand them over to Georgia.
Yeah, so as Judge Shannon said, we are the archive for the circuit court. So we only hold the court's records from the beginning of the county until about 1940. And so I like to say, I'm not an expert on newspapers at all, but we use them pretty much on a daily basis. We have a lot of people coming in for genealogy, for land record research, but we usually end up using newspapers and Ancestry for all the other vital records and things like that. So usually someone will come in with a research and I'll say, we can provide the black and white, and then I'll send them to the Virginia room, I say, to add the color and some more of the historical context. But a lot of times, we can also provide some of the color as well. So in this case, we have this news article about the teachers. So it says the examination for white teachers was held in the schoolhouse at this place on Tuesday and Wednesday. The examination of the colored teachers followed yesterday and today. And so George and I, in preparation for this, we were just going down the list of all of the news articles we could see mentioning Fairfax. And so he mentioned this, but he didn't really think we would have something on it. But we do. So this is a book about it's the record of teachers examined and contracted with. And we don't normally have school board records, except for there was a court case in the 1890s where the treasurer for the school board was in trouble for misappropriating funds. And he specifically was in trouble for not giving enough to the colored schools that he was supposed to. So we have all this evidence because of this court case, and we have a lot of information from the 1890s, which is missing from the census records, because that's the year that the census records, they don't exist federally. So inside we actually have a school census, like a school student and their parents census for all of Fairfax County. We have all of the students that were examined, and we have where they taught, we have how much they were making, we have all kinds of information from about the 1890s for Fairfax County and when it comes to teachers. So we see the summary there, and it has, of course, it's broken up. It has the white teachers there, how many were examined, and the colored teachers. And then we also have in the records, it lists how old they were, their race, their gender, how many years they've taught, and which grade they're trying to teach. And then it shows where they live. And so this is how projects get started. When I was explaining this and showing this to George, he's like, we need to have someone go in there and map where people are traveling from and to which schools they're teaching at, because a lot of the teachers, especially for the colored schools, are coming all the way from DC. So this is how this goes. And so this is one. A lot of times we find, well, we do in the archives, we find records in newspapers accidentally. We're looking for something else, and then we'll find something. So it's really interesting. This one is from the Washington Bee, and it's talking about a court case where there's a man being charged for stealing cows, a few cows. It was all worth $90. And I was wondering why this is in the Washington Bee, which was a black newspaper. I did recognize the name Quander. That's a family that's been in the Mount Vernon community. It's a black family that's been in the Mount Vernon community for a very, very long time. So I was wondering if that was it. But if you go to the next slide, I see in the Fairfax Herald, which is considered the white newspaper, it's because the man who's charged with stealing the cows is a colored lawyer, which it doesn't say that in the Bee, naturally. So another thing that, I don't know if we'll have too much time to get into this, but one of the things that George talks about using is, I guess, the racism in our records. So it doesn't specifically say that Quander is a black man, and I just wanted to make sure. But we can use our records. In this case, I use the tract of land, the land taxes, to make sure that Felix Quander was actually from the family that I know. But we also have some of the other segregated records are the voting records. Marriage licenses, that's how we can see what we're looking at. So, and then as George was talking about earlier, the colored fair, this one came up, I don't remember, we were looking at charters. And we happen to see this is the charter of when they established the Colored Fair Association. And so I think it's interesting that in the article about the colored fairs, in Virginia, the only fairs available is Fairfax and then Suffolk, but that's not a colored fair, the one in Suffolk. So we went down the rabbit hole with this one previously, and it's actually in Idlewood is where the fair was. We also have, so anytime there was a change in stakeholders, anything like that, they would have to provide documentation to the court. So we have all of these people, like all the directors that were elected. And the reason I had this scanned originally was because Edwin Henderson from Falls Church was coming in, and I happened to see that his grandmother, Mary Ellen Henderson, and my kids both went to Mary Ellen Henderson Middle School. So I was like, I know her. And so I was like, here's your grandmother on this Colored Fair Association. But we see like all the communities in Fairfax County, the black communities, coming together for this celebration. And it's just entertaining. We also have in the court records, anytime they had the fair, they would appoint special constables to assist the sheriff with the fair. And so they were, I guess, essentially the first black sheriffs in Fairfax County. And it's also kind of fun to read. Let's see. So in 1918, because of the Spanish flu, it was canceled. The colored fair was canceled, and the white fair was canceled as well. And then in 1920, like after we've gone through a pandemic now, I kind of understand this. Like it was a little unruly. But clearly, the newspaper articles advertising the colored fair, they got to a lot of people who came to the fair because it ended up like there was a shootout. The sheriff wanted to arrest some of the people, but he's like, I don't know who any of these people are. And if they had lived in Fairfax County, he would have known. So he's like, I guess they'll just get away. And then another one that we just happened, so a lot of what I do is paper flattening. We unfold papers that have been folded for 100 years. We flatten them, we put them in folders. We label them and we make indexes so that the public can access these records. And so I was processing these liquor licenses, and I saw the residence of an applicant was Collingwood Beach. It was for Woolen, and I'd never heard of it. So I was researching Collingwood Beach. There wasn't very much on it. And then the history commissioner for Mount Vernon happened to come in, and she's like, I'm doing research on Collingwood Beach. And so Collingwood Beach was it was an excursion event. Like they had a riverboat. It was started by a white riverboat captain, L.J. Woolen. It was in the 1890s, and it was one of the few that exclusively solicited African American excursion parties. And then the other one was Notley Hall in Maryland. So this is one of the advertisements for it in the Washington Bee, and it was used mostly by fraternal organizations and churches, things like that. And then in the Washington Bee, there was an article, and these are my favorite parts of any newspapers, are the advertisements, the nosy movements of just like so-and-so's sister was visiting, like all those kinds of fun things. And then the opinion pieces. So there was this piece in the Washington Bee called Clara to Louise. And I found this really interesting because when I first learned about Collingwood Beach, I was like, that's great. That's great that there's a place just for African Americans to visit. But in this one, it says, I attended the excursions of the 15th Presbyterian Church at Collingwood Beach Monday. I can't see why our churches patronize this place. I have no fault to find with Mr. Woolen because he has done all he can, all that can be done to give the colored people a respectable place on the water. I would suggest the necessity of our people of petitioning the next Congress to take away the charters of these steamboat companies unless they accommodate all classes of citizens, irrespective of color. I think it is a shame and a disgrace to the capital of the nation where the laws are made for the entire country to have it said that the portion of the citizens are discriminated against in the account of color, which is why it's so important to check multiple newspapers. And this one, I wasn't sure if we would have time to put this one in here, but this was one of those, it's how most of our information is found. We had a patron who was trying to identify the men in this photo. And so she blasted a whole bunch of us, archives, and she said, who are the men in these photos? I know one is a certain man, and I know it had something to do with a court case. And so the Virginia Room librarian, he came back and he said, this is the case. And then we ended up finding out that this case, it was in 1935, it was a criminal case against a woman who was, a black woman who was charged with burning her house. And she was not happy with the jury that was selected for her case. It was all white men. And so her lawyer did a great job of laying out, she cites the 14th Amendment. And so it ended up, they summoned 7 men. It was the first all-black jury in Fairfax County, and we are trying to figure out if it was the first in the state, in the country. But this is part of a project that we're working on with the court in highlighting this case in Fairfax County.
The one thing I would say is that this is a very iterative process in trying to use these resources, and my students come to Georgia, then they come back to me, and that's the way this kind of process works. And then it's very much, it takes a lot of time, but it's a very rewarding experience. So.
Again, thank you all for having me here. I'm Ted Johnson. I'm a contributing columnist for the Washington Post, and I do some other things at think tanks in DC and that sort of thing. I need to pick up on this proximity search. I didn't know about that, so yeah. That'll be super helpful. I just figured I'll take about 10 minutes just to tell you a couple stories about some of the research I've come across and then my path to writing, which is non-traditional. I'm not actually a journalist. I'm an opinion columnist. So I don't do reporting, but I do tons of research to ensure that the opinions I express are informed ones and not just riffing off the top of my head. So the first story I want to tell is actually from Alexis's paper. I was in the military. I decide, you know what, I'm coming up on year 20, and I don't think I want to stick around. I'm less interested in what China's doing in cyberspace and more interested in the way race impacts our democracy. So I started charting my path out and decided I'll go grab a doctorate in law and policy, do some research on Black electoral behavior, and that way when I go to the think tanks and newspapers and say I want to write about race and democracy, the Navy stuff in my resume wouldn't be the only thing. I'd have some real research. So one story that I came across that just fascinates me is the story of African diplomats in the 1950s. This is a time when a lot of these sub-Saharan African nations were gaining their independence after colonization had ended. And as they declared their independence, they do what all nations do, which is to send diplomats to the United States, to the United Nations, present their credentials to the White House, State Department, and then take their spot as an ambassador or at the consulate. And so as a lot of these new African ambassadors are arriving in the United States, they're flying into New York. And then in the 50s, not everyone flew everywhere like we do today. They just drove from New York down to DC to present their credentials. And the path from New York to DC went through Route 40 in Northern Maryland. And Route 40, Northern Maryland is sort of like Eastern Maryland. It's a different part of the state than like PG County or Baltimore. And so a lot of the diners along Route 40 were segregated. And so as these African diplomats are pulling over to use the restroom, spend the night, get a cup of coffee, they're being told, we don't serve Black people here. And then they have to show up to Kennedy or at the State Department and say, yeah, you know, I ran into some trouble. We just wanted to spend the night. We wanted to get some gas, wanted to get something to eat, and they wouldn't serve us. And this became a problem because this is the time when the Soviet Union is saying, communism is a better way than democracy. And if you think democracy is so great, then why does the United States lynch its Negroes? And so Jim Crow was now becoming an international problem because it wasn't just Black Americans getting caught up in the web. It was now African diplomats in the middle of a Cold War. And sub-Saharan Africa was a battleground for the Cold War, just as Southeast Asia was. So Kennedy gets involved, President Kennedy gets involved, the State Department gets involved. They talk to the governor of Maryland, they talk to the diner owners, and they're saying, look, we hear you, but if we serve these Black folks, then the truckers, the white truckers that we serve, they're not coming here, and we don't make money. So eventually, this goes on for several months. And it became such a national security issue that the Kennedy administration sort of weighed down on the state administration. And eventually, the diner owners agreed to serve African diplomats only. So if those diplomats would come, they would serve them in a separate room so that the truckers wouldn't have the indignity of drinking coffee next to an African diplomat. And that was seen as a happy medium. And I came across all this in political science journals and in books from scholars, all interesting stuff. But in Alexis's paper, The Baltimore Afro-American, there was another tidbit that made this even more interesting to me. Reporters from that paper got word of this and decided, oh, well, we hear it's now been desegregated on Route 40, so we're gonna go test it out. And they weren't served. And so what they do is they go and rent a limousine. They go get dressed up in tuxedos, and they tell these diner owners that they're from the fake African nation of Goban. And they are served in the Howard Johnson diner, and they do this in a couple of places and write a feature piece in the Afro-American about this experience. There's even a picture of them in tuxedos being served in a diner, even though they're African Americans and not African diplomats. The point of the story, at least what I took from it, is that even in the face of a national security risk or threat, the face of Jim Crow being counter to the Reconstruction Amendments, the desegregation of Route 40 only went as far as the national interest. As soon as the African ambassadors were appeased, the national interest had been satisfied, and it didn't matter that Black Americans couldn't be served at the diner down the street, but African ambassadors from across the Atlantic could be served. And it was investigative reporters from a Black newspaper that revealed that last tidbit that so embarrassed the state government and those diner owners that eventually, I think some months later, it was completely desegregated for everyone. So that's the power of the kind of work that Black newspapers do. I don't, as I mentioned, I don't come to this work naturally. I grew up in North Carolina. I went off to Hampton University for undergrad, and I was a math major, not really sure what I wanted to do with my life. So I went to the military because the military had money and jobs, and I wouldn't go back home and sleep on my parents' couch after graduation. So I went to the military to it was sort of a rite of passage into manhood. I was going to do it for 4 years, get on my feet, figure out what I wanted to do with life, and then leave. And I ended up staying for 20. 2011, 2012, I was a White House fellow during the first Obama administration, and I got to see so many conversations about domestic policy, and the veil of Washington was lifted for me, and I got to see the people in those rooms making decisions, and thought, good people, I could do this. You know, like you don't have to be super smart or like a genius to want to serve the country in a different way than the military. And that fellowship got me thinking about things beyond my career path. And then the next year, 2012, was when Trayvon Martin is killed. Now, I've got 3 boys, 3 sons, dark-skinned dreadlock boys. And so this is where cyber is not as interesting to me anymore, especially as my boys are coming into their teen years. So I started charting my path out of the military to think about race and democracy and what I could add to the conversation to maybe leave a better version of the country than the one I inherited. Leave a better version for my kids. So in 2016, I retired from the military with like 20 years, 9 months so of service. I finished my doctorate that same time. And my last job in the military was as a speechwriter for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And here's the thing of the many fun things we did there and stressful things. The main thing that stood out for me relevant to this conversation is we would, in preparing the general for congressional testimony on Senate issues or on the House, Armed Services, Intelligence, whatever it may be, we would prepare the written testimony and the oral testimony, submit the written for the record, and then he would recite the oral in the hearing. And to get those materials ready, we would talk to professors and academics and think tank folks and do all this research. And then we would have a perfect product ready for the general, and he'd get in the hearing and he'd say his statement, turn it over to the Congress folks for questions. And they would say, I was reading Tom Friedman in the New York Times this morning, and he says China is going to eat our lunch. What are you guys doing about it? Not what the Brookings guy said, not what the scholars from George Mason said, but like the 800-word column in the newspaper that morning was what the Congress people were reading, and that was shaping their views, even on very serious conversations with the most senior military advisor in the country. And so then I recognized that if my dissertation was going to sit on a shelf somewhere, maybe never get picked up again, but if I was able to distill those insights for a broader audience, then maybe I could have more of an impact. So that's what really led my journey to start writing. When I first started submitting columns, I was getting told no all the time, or not even getting responses back. And just through some luck and some connections here and there, I eventually began to make a name for myself and bylines, and then this turns into this position with the Post. For the Post, I write about race, democracy, American identity, and all the ways those things challenge one another and prevent us from becoming the more perfect union, because we always get stumbled up on this question of equality and fairness and righting past wrongs. And so instead of bringing more data and survey information to polls, I try to bring stories and make big issues human-sized so that the average reader doesn't need to have a doctorate in public policy or history or political science to understand what a what some regression may have said about survey data. They can just read the story of these 3 investigative reporters that exposed the hypocrisy on Route 40 to where freedom wouldn't touch Black folks that were Americans, but were extended to African ambassadors because that was what was in the national interest and not the eradication of Jim Crow. So I'm going to stop here, but I want to tell one more story from a Black newspaper. This one's from the Pittsburgh Courier. And this is there's a guy in Kansas who works on an assembly line for aircraft parts during World War II. Right, this is the time of the draft. This guy, he's a black guy. He fears he's going to be drafted as well, and not fears. He knows it's going to happen, and he's not happy about it. Not because he doesn't want to serve the country, but because this is Jim Crow America. This is a man that is going to be drafted to go fight in a war, and he doesn't get to enjoy the very freedoms that we're supposed to be going around the world to protect. And so he writes a letter to the editor, to the Pittsburgh Courier. This is another example of black newspapers not being regional. I mean, like you were saying, 300 people in this city, a readership of 1,500. Black newspapers were regional and sometimes national in nature, not just in the locality of where they were based. So he writes the Pittsburgh Courier and says, look, I hear you. We got to defeat communism. We got to get rid of, authoritarianism. It all makes sense to me. I'm for democracy abroad, but I'm also for democracy at home. And he says, I'm calling for a double V campaign, double victory, victory abroad and victory at home for democracy, so that the people who fight in our nation's wars don't return home to be a second-class citizen, but they get to enjoy the very freedoms they helped spread through victory in World War II. We know that after World War II, when black veterans came back, some of them were lynched in their uniforms. We know after World War II, when black veterans came back, that they were not able to access the GI Bill and the VA loans that created the middle class, both through education and through home ownership. And we know that left black families behind with the red. I mean, there's a whole story to be told about how black veterans were treated afterwards, not out of hatred necessarily, but out of the hierarchy that Jim Crow America had in place. So this double victory campaign was both about military fights abroad, but also about policy fights at home. And I'd like to think that I'm now working on the second V of this double victory campaign. I've done my time in the military, did my 20 years. Now I've not given up the fight for democracy. I've just changed which V I'm working on. And we've got black newspapers and a letter to the editor from a young guy in Kansas to thank for that framework that I still think very much impacts how we view race and democracy in America, and then what the future of this country could look like if we get that mix correct. So thank you again. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alexis Taylor, and as it was said, I'm the managing editor of the Afro-American newspapers, the Baltimore Afro, as you heard them say tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. When I heard that there was an event like this that is focused on the amendments, I felt like I'd found my tribe of nerds because a whole month dedicated to these amendments that significantly shaped the future of African Americans in this country. I think it is a very necessary event. It's a very necessary topic. When you talk about Black press, I personally got involved in Black press in 2011 as an intern. I started as an intern at the Afro-American newspapers. I was a student at Morgan State University. I was a photography major. And I said, well, I'll just throw something on to really make money so my parents approve and say a minor in journalism. And little did I know it would be the thing that really tied me to this region for more than a decade. I thought that I would get my degree from Morgan State University and go back up to New York where I had started my college career, and 15 years later, I am still here in Baltimore, and it's solely because of the Afro. The Afro-American newspapers, to me, it's such a work of love. And I say that because if you are a member of the Black press, you are dedicated. I mean, we have an exhibit right now. It's a permanent exhibit inside of the Baltimore Museum of Industry. So if you come up to Baltimore and you want to learn more about the Afro-American newspapers and how it was actually put onto the page, you can visit the Baltimore Museum of Industry and go to one of their demonstrations where they show you how much it took to just print the masthead, to just put one line of type onto the page. If you made a mistake, that meant that you're recasting letters individually, not words, but letters to make the word that make the sentence for the paragraph. I think that if you were in this business at any point in the 18 or early 1900s, I mean, it was something that you were dedicated to because you knew that you had something to say and you knew that there were people out there who needed information. And so the Afro was founded in 1892 by John Henry Murphy Sr. This was a man who was a slave. This was a man who started a newspaper in 1892 when less than 3% of the African American population could read in this country. This is a man who fought in the Civil War. This is a man who literally put his life on the line like so many other Black writers and editors. I mean, when you talk about Ida B. Wells being run out of the South, you know, I think people take that lightly. You know, here in 2024, we might have people who get upset. They go to social media, they'll leave you a bad review. But we're talking about a time where putting down your opinion on paper and disseminating that through the masses could get you killed, and not just shot, I mean lynched, I mean brutally, horrifically murdered, because that is how important it was to have the Black people informed, and that is how important it was to have Black voices being put on record. And so when I think about that time that the Afro started, 1892, we're talking about these different amendments that were shaping African and American life. But I think of the bravery and the heart that it took. And when we're talking about the amendments, the Afro-American newspapers, 1892. But in 1827, you have Russwurm and Cornish saying that we're putting out the first African-American publication because we wish to plead our own cause. And so I think that that's one thing that has shaped my career. I did take a break, and I was a Baltimore City public schools teacher for about 6.5 years. But all through that time, I was still a writer. And I'll tell you, the one thing that will keep you awake after you've taught 36 kindergartners is being frustrated with something. You know, yes, there are good positive stories. I'm sure there are journalists who love to write the positive things, but I can tell you one thing that really fires me up for Black press is to hear about, even in 2024, the health disparities, the disparities in education, the generational wealth that is missing from the Black community here in 2024. Those are the things that get me 12 o'clock after a long day, banging out another article, putting out interview requests. And so I'll say still today in 2024, we are pleading our own cause. Russwurm and Cornish said that for far too long, there were people speaking for us. And I think that when they came out with that publication, Freedom's Journal in 1827, it was the boldest statement that you could make that says, we know our issues. And I love that he says that. He doesn't say that, you know, Black people are perfect. He says we know that we have our issues within our own community, as we still do today. But at the same time, there are still so many things that need to be addressed. And we are knowledgeable enough, and we are able to communicate our own desires, our own challenges. We can speak on those. We have our own solutions within our community. And so I think that's why still today, in 2024, it's important to plead your own cause, to speak for yourself, because we know that if we let people speak for us, one, they may not be well informed. They're going to be twisting the story however they can to fit their narrative. And we see that even in Florida right now. You know, a middle school curriculum being passed to say that slaves benefited from slavery. I think the beauty of the Black press is that we can put on record, no, we were blacksmiths before we even came to this country. We knew how to do iron work before we ever stepped foot on a boat to come here. And so I think that's the important thing about Black press, just putting on record not only our challenges, but those triumphs as well. And when I say put it on record, I really do mean the Black press put things on record. Georgia, you were talking about the addresses for the teachers. When I see things like that, I absolutely love it, because I can, if I choose to, go stand in that very spot of that teacher. And I'll tell you a story with the Afro-American newspapers. a couple of years ago, the women of the 688th Postal Directory Battalion. Has anybody heard of the women of the 688? Okay, all right. The women of the 688th Postal Directory Battalion, it was a group of Black and Hispanic women. We're now finding out that there were a few women from the Hispanic or Latino community involved in the 6888 unit. But it was a majority Black unit of Black women who were sent overseas during World War II. And the Afro had, the Afro is founded by John Henry Murphy. It's the Murphy family. It's a family-run paper still today. And so a member of the Murphy family was embedded in this unit. And so we had war correspondents. The first Black female war correspondents for World War II were for the Afro-American newspapers. And so these women were sent overseas to clear mail. And, you know, in 2024, we have to say more than just they were sent over there to clear mail. I was speaking to our new batch of interns that started this month, and I had to ask them, you know, well, what do you do when you leave your phone home? What do you do when Instagram is down or if Twitter isn't working? A good bit of them flip out. They can't, you know, it's an addiction at this point. You have to be connected to information, to your cell phone. And so I told them, just think about being in a war zone and there's no communication, and you left a pregnant wife or a sick mother back home in the States. And so now you're in a war zone. There's no communication for months. You don't know if that baby was born, if that baby survived, if your mother or father is still alive. And so it was affecting morale. And we take that and we say affecting morale, but in that mindset of being in a war zone and not having that connection to your family and not knowing what was going on, it was affecting morale. And so these women went overseas and they cleared backlogs of mail, millions of pieces of mail. I mean, we see the pictures from the Afro archives and it literally is floor to ceiling bags of mail. And we know that this was a result of the military preparing for D-Day. And so in efforts to make sure that D-Day went off and that there were no security breaches, they started to carefully review every single piece of mail, which created a backlog and then in the end affected soldier morale. And so they send these Black women overseas to fix it, and they do. What they thought would take months and months, over a year, these women do in less than 4 months. They clear this backlog of mail. They get all of the mail lines back up and running. And what I love about this story is that there were over 840 women in this unit, and the Afro printed all of their addresses. And so as a result of the Afro printing those addresses, we had retired Colonel Edna Cummings, who she was trying to get these women the Congressional Medal of Honor. First, she went to all of the senators, she went to all of the elected officials at once and said, hey, we should honor these women. And, you know, they're like, oh, okay, get out of here. But then she found in the Afro this list of addresses. And so then she was able to say, hey, South Carolina, these are the women from your state. You should honor them. And then, you know, they were more open to that idea. And she did that for every single state that had an address in the Afro for the young lady who was serving overseas. And so as a result, state by state by state, when they all looked up, they said, oh, we all agreed on this. And then they gave them the Congressional Gold Medal in 2022. And so that is directly tied to the dedication of the Black press printing those addresses. I think that humanizes the life that you're talking about. And it just gives you more context. You know, I think that one of my favorite lines in this documentary, I said I'm a nerd. My professor at Morgan showed us a documentary, Soldiers Without Swords. Has anyone seen that? I highly recommend that you find it. It's on YouTube, Soldiers Without Swords. And it is a documentary on the Black press now. He showed it to us as an assignment, and then I just kept rewatching it like it was a top 10 movie. I don't know why. But I love that because what they say in that documentary is that in mainstream press, we didn't die, we weren't born, we didn't get married, we didn't do any of those things. We committed crimes though. but we didn't, have a full rounded life story that was told. And so I think that is why I'm still here. I started in 2011 and it's 2024. And I'm still dedicated to putting on record those different tidbits of African American life. And then as well as the major things that happen. That's one thing that I love as well. I'm telling you, I'm really a nerd. I'm sorry. But I was watching a movie in 2019 and someone said a line like, this is going to be worse than the pandemic of 1918. And so anytime that I see something like that, I go to the Afro-American Newspapers archives, and that is available on ProQuest. I go there and I see what was the Black perspective. And I love to do that because I did it in God, I'm sorry, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I did it in 2019 because they said something about the pandemic. And so in July of 2019, I was looking up how was the Black population affected by the pandemic? Where did the term Spanish flu even come from? And we know that that's not the term that we really probably should be using, but that's colloquially how it's known. But what you saw in the Afro about the last pandemic, in 1919, we're recording Black soldiers who are shipped from Baltimore to basic training in the South. And when they get there, they can't leave the base. And if they do try to leave the base, they're shot. And it has their addresses and all of that of all of the people who are dying from the pandemic. They talk about how the communities struggle when it comes to church and when it comes to school. I wish I had known I was looking at a blueprint of what was about to happen, but I mean, it's in the papers. You can go to the papers and you can see that they're struggling over, should we have this parade? Well, Philly decides to have their parade, and then surprise, surprise, more than 2/3 of the participants are sick in the weeks after. It's a super spreader of the 1919 year. And so it was just really, really interesting to see how the Black population deals with things that nationally we know of. Another thing I will say is that when it comes to Black press, you just really have to understand that these papers, we just had our you have to understand that these papers have sustained and that it is a strong partnership between the Black church, that Black community, and that's really where you see a lot of Black publications coming from. And so I will say in closing, if you're going through the archives, just keep that in mind. The Afro started as a church newsletter, a merging of two church newsletters. And so still today, people might say that Black press is slanted, Black press is biased, but Black press tells the truth from a Black perspective, not necessarily a biased perspective, but it is a Black perspective. The events that we record are church events, the education events, what's going on in our schools. And so it's still today, the Afro is strongly tied to the Black church, which we know in an election year and in election years past, that was a powerful combination. When you have the Black press and the Black church linked up together, even in 2024, the Biden administration is pouring money into that relationship because they know that Black press and the Black church have historically had a strong partnership, and that is where you reach the Black community. And so still today, I mean, that's one of our strongest partners. Still today, the community is one of our strongest partners. I love when people send in their letters to the editor complaining about something that they're upset about. But I think that when you, when you see that, you understand just how powerful the resource is, that people are still engaged, that people still want to see themselves on the page. People still want to see their stories on the page. And so even in 2024, I mean, we're still thriving with the support of the Black community, Black church, Black elected officials. And I will say, in real closing, our partner is Afro Charities. And so Afro Charities is our sister company, and that's who holds our archives. And so they curate it, they work in the schools, they have the students go through the archives and create poems and artwork based on the things that they read. But I would say that the power of the archives is that it shows us where we've been. It's a blueprint for where we can go. And it just puts on record those things, those little tidbits, but also the major things that are happening in America from a Black perspective.
So I think we do audience questions now.
Any questions?
Hi, I have a question. It occurred to me as you were speaking that the importance of the newspapers, are young Black people reading newspapers? I look at my own children in their 30s and 40s. They read online newspapers, but I think they miss a lot just looking at the online version of a newspaper. You know, going through page by page and picking up little tidbits is so, to me, maybe I'm just biased because I've read newspapers since I was 8 or 10, but how are you reaching out to this younger community and getting them to hear the word?
Sure. So I'll say that I too am biased. I don't like e-readers. I want the actual pages turned in my hand. But we know that the younger generation, they want digital. They want digital content. And so one thing that I'll say is that we have worked really hard to go digital as a Black media company. And so we hit it from multiple points. So let's say we have, for example, a festival that comes to town. One, we know that there are going to be younger artists there that are tied to the younger population that we're trying to reach. So we'll make sure that we're including news that they want to see. But then we also make sure that we put it on social media. We make sure that we're not just doing an article, but that we make the TikTok to go with the article. So let's say they don't want to read a full 600-700 word article. They can go to our social media platforms and they can pull out the interviews and the little TikTok videos that we do. We also have an e-edition of the paper. So someone mentioned that subscriptions are it's a lifeblood for Black newspapers. And so we offer an e-edition that comes out one day after our print edition. We go to print every Wednesday, and then Thursday we have our print edition come out. And then on Fridays, we have the entire print edition sent out via email to our e-subscribers. And so they'll be able to, virtually click through the paper. That doesn't really do it for me. And we also recently returned to doing things like crossword puzzles and little trivias that you can't put online. And so that's more specific to that print subscriber. But I will say that print isn't going anywhere anytime soon, as long as we have laws that say that you have to print classifieds. And so, that's one thing that's keeping us around. I can tell you at the Afro, with that law, they know that everyone doesn't have access to the internet. And so you have to print notices and things about property and estates and things like that. So print isn't going anywhere. That's not, whether we have a print edition or not is not beholden to what our readers are necessarily doing right now. It's more, do we have the ads to support a print product? And we do. People are advertising more and more in Black publications every day because they know that it's an election year. They know that there are younger populations that they want to reach, specific age groups they want to reach. And so they know that Black press can do that. But I think it's social media, pulling in the social media. Threads just came about, so we have a Threads page. There's a YouTube page, and we try to diversify what we're doing. We also have little podcast type shows. So Monday we do a rundown of weekend headlines, but that's virtual. And then on Thursdays, we have Chicken Box, where we choose one specific topic, and then the writers and the publisher all, discuss all angles of that topic. So I would just say diversifying our brand to include social media content, short videos, long format videos, photo albums that you can click through where it's not just a full article, but you could just click through the photo album. Just responding to what people want as far as additional content outside of the article. Yes, ma'am.
I had something. I wanted to tell you how much I appreciate the Afro newspaper. I grew up on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and I was in high school in the 1950s. And both the Afro-American and the Pittsburgh Courier were the newspapers that my parents brought into the house. And at that time, it was important, as you mentioned, to have some way of communicating the stories of the Black community. So I'm very happy to know that it is alive and thriving and doing so well, because it really helped us in our daily lives to read about other African Americans, not just in our area, but all over. And I had another comment. Georgia, I believe you mentioned that there were some African American teachers who lived in D.C. And, well, one of the local heroes is Mrs. Louise Archer. The school on Nutley Street was named after she passed away. And she came to Vienna from Washington, D.C. in 1922. And she was teacher and principal until she passed away in 1948. And she commuted daily. And the story goes from students some who are still living, that as she was coming into the Vienna area, any children who were walking to school, she would pile them into her car and bring them the rest of the way. And that is a true story. There are many people who were included in that experience. So I just wanted to mention her. She was a commuter, and but she loved Vienna. It was almost as if she was a citizen in this town because of the way she cared for the people and has left an indelible memory.
Thank you for that. I love that all across the country, really, people have an Afro story. I will say that at the height of the Afro, we had 13 editions up and down the East Coast. And so people here love their Baltimore Afro. People in Washington love their Washington Afro. But there was a Richmond Afro. There were Afro papers all up and down the East Coast. And so I love to hear these stories of people reading the paper as children, delivering the paper as children. And we're still here because of all of those readers. So thank you.
I actually moved to Vienna because of Louise Archer. I actually, is it working? I moved to Vienna for Louise Archer. My mentor was a librarian, and I'm a librarian and an archivist. And actually, Georgia, you and I were on a Mid-Atlantic Region Archives Conference together. And Louise Archer is just so dear to my heart, and I live in the second location, right next door to where the second location was for the colored school. And anyway, that's a whole thing. But the Wade Hampton part of my story with Georgia is that we were on a panel with archivists because Virginia and specifically Fairfax County was looking at name changes that happened with the 50th and the 100th year anniversaries. And we have this teeny weeny street with like four families on it called Wade Hampton Drive. And people were like, why do you want to change it? And the more I studied it and the more I continued to study it, this man did not deserve a street. And there was a little bit of pushback, but he came from a family that just kept on getting more power, having more slaves, fought Reconstruction and so on. And I'm just very proud of Vienna for sticking to it. And I think it's really important to use libraries, use archives, listen to podcasts, and things like that, and learn why things happened. That's a big thing for me. And I know this is popular culture, and I do know that there are kids that are watching The Gilded Age. And I know there is that one sub-story that's going on with the African American paper that's being put together, and there's a love story and so on. But it still does show a part of what was going on the East Coast, and specifically in New York, having to do with getting to know Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, all these different kind of people. And so that is a way sometimes to get the younger generation going, what? There were newspapers back then by African Americans? How could that be? And then the last thing I wanted to say was that Ted, I loved that you said that you like to bring big stories to the human size. I think that is just, that's what life is about. So thank you very much for that.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. And it's validating because sometimes the most read articles in the Post, for example, are usually the most sensational and controversial ones. And so when you tell just sort of like a good neighbor story or some vignette from history, and without throwing a bunch of invective around, you just never know who's reading, and sometimes it feels like it gets lost. So I appreciate the vote of confidence there. I'm a firm believer that I think it was like the Greek philosophers used to say the city-state was the perfect size for any society because it was large enough to where you could be anonymous, but small enough to where you basically knew everyone. And so I think of big wicked problems in the same way. Make them small enough to where they feel tangible, but not so small that they feel like they only apply to the vignette you shared. That it's still a sort of a social share problem, but one that could be tackled. So, all good.
Well, I want to thank all of you for this is very interesting, very exciting, all the history that you've done on that. I have two comments. One is Catlett, Virginia. One of the teachers at Louis Archer is from that place. That's Cheney Henderson, is from Catlett, Virginia. So that's very interesting. One of our teachers in Louis Archer was from that. Also, Afro-American, a part of my community here in Vienna. Read it all the time. I was in it once as a debutante, so that was very cool. But also they talked about my high school, and it was something we always read for politics as well, because we're very strong in paying our poll taxes and who to vote for. But I want to compliment that that's still going on today. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. And I mean, again, that's what I love about the Afro. There are so many little stories in there that really aren't little at all. I love that every day there are people from around the country who are emailing and calling archives to say things just like that. I was a debutante in whatever year on whatever date, and my picture was printed. Can you find it? And the answer is yes, we do have it. And so thank you for that.
And sorry, and I will say one of the things that's really interesting about the Baltimore Afro-American is that a lot of what scholars are doing now is using different kind of digital models so that we can do text mining analysis that would compare what's going on in the Baltimore Afro-American and compare it with the Baltimore Sun, right? And you can kind of see what are the core issues that are important to the Black community and look at how they're being ignored in the kind of mainstream press, if we want to use that framework, right? And I just want to say one more thing, which is you brought up the really important issue of bias, and that seems to be this very negative term that we throw around. And one thing I teach my students, because I'm not just a librarian, I'm a professor, right? I teach my students there's no such thing as a neutral source. The source was constructed for a purpose, right? Whether it's the mainstream press or the sources for the Black community. And so we need to understand that, embrace it, to better understand the context, because there ain't no such thing as a neutral source, and there's no such thing as a neutral archive. There's no such thing as a neutral whatever. So anyway, I really think these are important issues that my colleagues here are bringing up, and I just wanted to amplify that.
No problem. That's a great point because I am a transplant to this area. I'm not from here at all. I'm from Memphis, Tennessee. And I made a point of this year to learn what in the world is going on with this amendment. I've been up here since 2012, and I've never paid attention once it started. I've never paid attention. Last year, I participated in the Juneteenth celebration at First Baptist Church of Vienna, which put me in a rabbit hole of research to learn about the general who gave the land to the, that happens to me often. So where I'm just like, what is this? What is this about? And I don't mind doing the research online or getting an old magazine or getting a newspaper because it's really good information to know what you're surrounded by. And so that's how I ended up in here today to hear this information. Sir, I want to thank you for your service. And I'm really appreciative of how nerdy you are because I've written several nerds. I've written several notes so that I can go and nerd out myself because this is the kind of information that's needed for us. I share a lot of information that I capture in the community, and I repackage it and I email it into our diversity groups in my work area. And I am a veteran, and so a lot of the information that you all have shared has really captured for me in my heart. I wanted to add to the thing about the mail. I served in Belgium, and I had to run the post office out of the blue. No post person. Oh, you're it now. You just landed. Now you're it. And I mean, pouring over the regulations for, we're in the Air Force, but the Army receives the mail in theater. You need to know what they're doing and what our regulations are, and then the postal regulations. And as you know, not receiving mail during mail call in theater busts you down. You're like, don't nobody love me? My mom used to send me the comics out of the newspaper because I used to read them all the time when I was coming up. I am 46, so I was still reading the newspaper before I left home. And we would read the comics together. You know, when you're only child, you have different kind of relationship with your mom. And we would read the comics and laugh out loud because it was funny. I forget the one with the dog, but
Marmaduke?
not Marmaduke, but I can see this. Anyway.
Heathcliff?
Because I go off on a tangent. But we would cut these cartoons out and keep them. And so when I left home for basic training, I had several comics folded. And every time I was homesick, I would just read the comics. And I would share the comics with the other girls in my barracks. And then my mom, terrible letter writer, has no words. I'm like, you couldn't say a sentence? But she would cut the cartoons because she knew that I loved it so much. And so there are different ways to reach the kids, especially if they like comics. you can use that as a way of garnering their attention. But I just want to say I appreciate you all for everything I'm learning today, and especially you all, because I'm like reading this stuff and I'm taking multiple pictures. I'm just like, I hope you have a class or some kind of group activity where you teach people how to use the resources to a greater extent, because I've learned that I have family ties to Virginia. I do have a family, genealogist. She retired from being a principal in one of the schools in Memphis and became a genealogist for the family. And so I've learned that I have roots up here. And so that's just one more thing that I want to go into a rabbit hole on. And so I just appreciate you all for everything that you're doing and your time and energy tonight.
Thank you, and thank you for your service.
Yeah, let's do one more, and then can we do two more? Is that okay?
I was really intrigued by the way you were able to reconstruct some of this history out of the old newspapers. And I was wondering if or how it might be possible to do something similar with electronic media. The advantage of print media is they're permanent, at least, more permanent than broadcast media, certainly. But the broadcast media must have been tremendously important and had a much larger audience 50, 100 years ago than Washington Post or Afro or whatever. But I don't know if there are any databases of the sort that you have.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So people started realizing that none of that was being recorded and kept very well back in the 60s. And so they started to kind of develop networks. Many of the individual stations keep their own archives, which are only really available to them, but you might be able to work with them. There's something called, oh gosh, I'm going to get the name wrong. So one of my colleagues at Mason did a book on the sniper. Remember the whole sniper thing that happened? And he used this one database that a lot of congressional people use that allows you to get at the local news. It's incredibly expensive. But the Congress people need to use it because they need to know what their constituents are thinking and what they're saying on their local news. I can't remember the name now, but the one that I do know a lot about is called the Vanderbilt Television News Archive, and that has a pretty good index. It does have things like the CNN stuff. It has a few other things that are indexed in there. There's also in LexisNexis transcripts of many of the kind of big news shows. This week I guess I'll show my age, David Brinkley, right, and all of those other kinds of shows like that. But there's not a lot of true archival collections. Oh, I'll take that back. There's another one up in University of Maryland has the Public Broadcasting Archives, which is excellent. And you can get at some of that kind of news coverage there. But they tend to be located in the individual news stations, as far as I know, and they don't make those easily available. It's a great question, though.
I'm married to George,
Oh.
so I was just going to tell the young lady over there, just get his phone number or email. He works people through things all the time.
Sure. No, I'm happy to help. This is such an easy trick, and it's like I went to library school, and I say this is like the one thing that was really worth it. Like I learned how to ask a computer questions. So yeah, I'm happy to share.
I'm sorry, I'm going to do one last thing, even though we're trying to close up, I realize. And that is, we haven't talked about the Colored Citizens News, and I want to really talk about that because The Fairfax Standard had a column, and many other
Yeah.
white newspapers had what was called something like the Colored Citizens News, written by a member of the black community. And unlike the Afro and the black newspapers, which are mirrors for that community and voices within that community, this was a window for the white community on what the experience was of black citizens. And there are cases where the columns that we're talking about, a church effort or a jobs effort or a justice effort, covered in the Colored Citizens News, reaches people and brings people into partnerships in interesting ways. So I just want to give some credit to whatever was going on elsewhere in the Fairfax Standard, for example.
Yeah.
These columns were illuminating issues for the white community as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Deb. So this was a feature that was in certainly the Fairfax newspapers, and it actually speaks a lot to the power of, what was the association called again? I'm going to blank.
Colored Citizens Association.
Colored Citizens Association, which turned into the first rural NAACP chapter, which happened to be in Fairfax. And it's, let's see, it's a team effort because I can't remember it all. But ultimately, they do bring a window into the problems that were important to that really strong political bloc. And in fact, that strong political bloc was so strong at one point in time that it caused Falls Church to have to change their whole, city lines, right? And so because they elected their own representative, and the white folks at this time said, "Oh heck no, we're not doing that," and so they kind of reacted to that. So this Colored Citizens Association was incredibly strong, and they talked about, it wasn't as overt or as strongly worded as many of the black newspapers, but they certainly were giving, as you say, a window into African American life, into at least in the Fairfax region. Very important, very important.
I will add, they also published in a lot of the black newspapers as well.
They did, you're right.
And yes, they got very involved, and a lot of them were also, they ended up being on the black jury in 1935.
No, they're incredibly, they're an amazing group. And there's a lot of untold stories here in Fairfax County, in Northern Virginia, in Loudoun, all over the region, that are just waiting to be kind of delved into.
Can I say something? I know we're wrapping up, but I love that you said that it was a window as well, and that black journalists writing for a black publication was more like a mirror. And that's very true. We were talking to other black people, talking amongst ourselves, talking in our community and spreading those, ideas in our community, within the black community. But the window is what brings about change. And I would say that without members of the media, black and white, you wouldn't have things like a Civil Rights Act of 1964, because without that window, it's easy to be in your house and shut the door and say, "Oh, what's that noise outside?" But it's a little harder to walk past a window and say, "Oh, wow, they're beating someone. They just sicked a dog on someone, and all they wanted to do was vote." And so I think that window is really what brought about a lot of change in this country, because they couldn't ignore that.
We could go on all night, I'm sure. Ted, Alexis, Georgia, and George, thank you for making this such a special event. Steve, Shannon, and I would love to take full credit for this. And as a politician, I have been known to take credit for other people's work. But the reality is that Deb Cohen-Smith really put this together. And she found the people. She came up with the idea. And she put this thing together, and she's really to be thanked for that. I would like to think that if Mercury were still here, he would say, "I think we hit a home run because he conceived of Liberty Amendments Month as both a sort of a reflection on our past and these 4 amendments and the path we as a country took to try to realize our destiny as a more perfect union, but also where we're going with it and what's happening today. And I can't think of a better panel that exemplifies this than one which has the past on the left and the present and future on the right. So this fits totally and squarely within that. The other connection I made while I was sitting there is that in some sense, we, the town of Vienna, are creating our own archive of these 4 amendments and what it means in stories. This is our 4th year. We've had liberty in libraries. We've had the legacy, the complicated legacy of George Mason. We've had we've had Loving versus Virginia, these different elements of the story that are being recorded and will be available for the future. So I would like to think that that is something that we're giving to the country, and would hope that more communities do this kind of thing to continue this conversation about these amendments and about who we are and where we should be going. So thanks everybody for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of Liberty Amendments Month, and have a good evening. Thank you.